Hello and a warm welcome to this week's edition of Africa 360. My name is Kwangu Liwewe. For many years, Kumi Naidoo has been an advocate for social justice, campaigning particularly against human rights abuses. 6 years ago, he became the first African to be appointed as head of Greenpeace International, which is a global non-profit organization that advocates for environmental justice. Greenpeace is known for its direct actions and has been described as the most visible environmental organization in the world. Today here on 360, we're in conversation with the head of Greenpeace, Kumi Naidoo.
A veteran social justice and environmental activist, Kumi Naidoo has on many occasions put himself in harm's way, fighting for what he believes in. And he's not shy to confront the prestigious or the powerful when pleading for his cause. Born in Durban, South Africa, Kumi was just 15 when he became deeply involved in the country's political struggle against apartheid. His activities in the student movement of the 80s, including violating a state of emergency, led to his arrest and forced him underground and eventually into exile. Kumi was not to return from England until after the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990. Upon his homecoming, Kumi began a career as a civil rights activist, leading campaigns to end poverty and protect human rights. His focus soon shifted to the environment. Concerned about the devastating impact of climate change on the poor, he quickly became a prominent environmental figure. He has since led mass global campaigns as head of Greenpeace, pleading with the developed world to reduce carbon emissions. If not addressed sooner, Kumi believes climate change devastation will threaten future generations.
I recently caught up with Kumi Naidoo during his visit back home here in South Africa. We spoke about issues relating to climate change, particularly the politics of environmental activism, as well as the social justice agenda. Thank you very much for speaking to Africa 360. Now, you've got an incredible track record when it comes to activism. You started at the age of 15. One would say it's actually in your DNA. My question to you now is, why were you so upset over the surveillance story when, well, naturally, the spooks must have been following you in and around South Africa and abroad?
Well, you know, people say maybe I'm being naive, but I want to give the government the benefit of the doubt. I've asked the minister to firstly confirm whether they shared anything with South Korea, and secondly, whether they do actually on a routine basis actually monitor me. I will know. I've been around for a while. In the old days, you know, when we went to mass meetings and the special branch agents were there, we could smell them, you know. So I will be able to make an assessment based on a response if one comes shortly. But in the meantime, I've also sought the support of the Legal Resources Center, and they are also seeking on my behalf now further information from government, and they will advise me on an appropriate course of action. And the idea here is, let's see if some positive learning can come out of it. And I would like to spark a public debate on the quality of our democracy right now. I would like...
Your bone of contention is actually just with the South African government. Because obviously when we look at other countries, you even mentioned it before that in Zimbabwe you've been followed when you're working for Civicus. It's a well-known fact that even in other countries they're probably watching you. So your main bone of contention is because it's your own government.
Exactly. I mean, firstly, you know, people have been saying in the media, and some of my friends and family discussing the situation over the last week have been saying, you know, this is a normal thing, you know, all governments do it and so on. Just because it's normal does not make it right. For some people, apartheid was normal. It wasn't right. Denying women the right to vote was normal. Doesn't make it right. So, or depending on oil, coal, gas, and nuclear for our energy security, you know, is seen as normal, but doesn't make it right. So essentially, yes, it happens with other, definitely know the Zimbabwean CIO, as it's known, were following me when I was in Zimbabwe and so on. But when your own government might have collaborated with another government, that hurts you as a citizen, especially in a context where we fought with a vision of democracy, which said that democracy is not simply the act of voting once every 4 or 5 years, but within the liberation struggle, whether it was the UDF, ANC, AZAPO, Black Consciousness Movement, PAC, and so on, all those movements always said that we want a society where citizens feel empowered to participate in public life, and what we want is participatory democracy. And I believe that these kinds of activities take us away from encouraging a truly participatory democracy, which is what I believe many of our people died for.
Mr. Naidoo, just hold on to that thought, and when we return, we're in conversation with Kumi Naidoo as we speak about various aspects of climate change on the continent and the democratic space in Africa.
If our governments do not wake up and smell the coffee soon, and if our business leaders who are holding our governments back, let's be very clear here, our governments largely act in the interests of the powerful people in their country.
Welcome back. Today I'm in conversation with Mr. Kumi Naidoo, who is the Executive Director of Greenpeace International, and we're talking about global politics and climate change, specifically looking at Africa. Just let's look at civil society's role in Africa, which seems to be diminishing. If we look back in the day when we had organizations such as Treatment Action Campaign, I mean, they were quite successful in the fight for HIV treatment. But lo and behold, today it doesn't seem as if civil society is doing much. And like an example I can give you is a campaign for Bring Back Our Girls in Nigeria. That hasn't borne much fruit.
I personally have been vigorously opposing the undermining of democracy, promotion of torture and so on that the US and so-called democratic promoting countries have done. But what it does is it's given a blank check to some governments who have a propensity away from democracy, because they can say, well, oh, those people, they are promoters of democracy and they are doing it, so we can do it as well. So I would say that right now there's a real challenge of fighting and protecting and expanding space for citizens to be able to participate in public life through organized formations.
You just said when the need arises, then the civil society, it has arisen.
No, totally. I mean, like if you take on climate change, right? Our continent as a whole has been least responsible historically or even presently for emissions. South Africa being an exception, right? South Africa is the 14th largest carbon emitter in the world. But the rest of the continent largely has been least responsible. And the irony, though, as always, Africa is paying the first and most brutal price.
Yes.
I mean, people need to understand that the atrocities that we saw in Darfur, right, was the first major resource war brought about as a result of climate impacts. And we are seeing many parts. You take Lake Turkana in northern Kenya, for example, the conflicts that have arose there. All of these are actually driven by climate impacts right now.
So do we expect to see more?
If our governments do not wake up and smell the coffee soon, and if our business leaders who are holding our governments back, let's be very clear here, our governments largely act in the interests of the powerful people in their countries. You know, democracy was supposed to balance the wallet with the ballot, right? Meaning the power of rich people was supposed to be balanced by the voices of ordinary people. But still, if we look at the choices that governments make on our continent as well as elsewhere, it's really, to a large extent, supporting the interests of the rich. You know, I jokingly say...
But who put these people into power? It's us, the people, the masses.
Yes, and let's look at our election systems. Let's look at how free and... You know, the problem is, in too many countries around the world, including in Africa, if you had an election and you won the election, you tick a box and you have democracy. We know that how closely contested, let's just take the Kenyan election in 2007, the violence that came out of it and so on. We know that in many countries on the continent, the media environment does not allow for a fair competition amongst all potential parties and so on. And I just want to say, though, it's not an African problem, because I describe the United States today, which nobody would say is the US a democracy. Of course, the US today I describe as the best democracy money can buy. And when you unpack which money buys that influence, it's oil, coal, gas, nuclear, military, and a few other industries. And so President Bush, for example, history will record, the oil industry bought that election for him lock, stock, and barrel, and history will record that he served the interests of that sector is paymasters.
I'll put it to you, that's the way of the world.
Well, this is our problem, though, right? Too many of us actually accept these, what I call abnormalities, these injustices, which is in contradiction to what our constitution says, what our democracy says, and so on. And I'd rather be influenced here by Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King once said in the 60s, he was ending a speech, and he said, today there's a very important term that we hear about called maladjusted in modern child psychology. And he said, we all want to be well adjusted to the world, and we don't want to suffer from schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. But then he went on to say, as I conclude my speech, I want to say, he said, I refuse to be well adjusted to racism. I refuse to be well adjusted to the fact that we will take necessities from the majority to give luxuries for the few. And today, if we are wanting to be good citizens, we must begin to contest that which we have accepted.
But are we empowered to do that? Especially Africans, are we empowered to do that?
Well, you know, there is a disease we have as well, not just in Africa, but around the world. We always are feeling that somebody has to empower us. I'm saying that good citizenship means for people to actually empower themselves and move forward. And let's be very clear, some of the things we saw in North Africa, right, with Tunisia, let's not forget, Tunisia was the country that actually, you know, gave rise to what people call the Arab Spring. I mean, I don't call it Arab Spring because I don't think the struggle for justice is a seasonal activity, okay, right? But if you look at it, those folks were not organized by international NGOs or big social movements. That was, I mean, of course, there were lots of people organizing that went on behind the scenes, but it was very much driven by people on the ground in a repressive situation saying enough is enough and no more. And what is... But
social media played quite a critical role. But then when you look at poor Africa, you look at the Malawians or the Zambians and the Tanzanians, do they have access to social media to stand up and voice their opinions?
That's true. Social media tends to be much stronger in the northern part of the continent than in the southern, and the south of the Sahara. But I would say that, again, let's be very clear. The space is not what it should be. We need to push for more space, to have more voice, and because, you know, our constitutions across the continent guarantee freedom of association, freedom of expression, and freedom of assembly. Right? These are fundamental democratic rights. And let me just say to our government leaders who are inclined not to respect those three freedoms, if you don't, then what you do is you push dissent and difference and protest activity, you push it underground. Right? Okay. And that's dangerous for democracy, that's dangerous for peace. Because if you take away, that's the same choice that Madiba faced, right? Because, you know, the move to the armed struggle in South Africa during that period was something that was taken with lots of pain and lots of reflection and with hesitation and trepidation. But what happened in that context was clearly all options of peaceful protest and expression and so on were taken away. So I say to governments, you close down democratic space at your own peril, you close it down at the risk of creating violence, and also you close down democratic space, risking that, in fact, people will say, well, what's the point writing a letter to the editor of a newspaper when we know that the editor has been told that if you publish those kinds of paper, I'll close your newspaper down. So those kinds of normal advocacy activities that people can engage in, if they are taken away, then it is government's fault, I believe, when we suddenly have a range of antisocial, violent, and other activities that emerge when people's voices are silenced.
Hold on to that thought. Do stay with us, because after the break, we continue our conversation with Kumi Naidoo.
If we look at West Africa, you know, there's been a raping of our ocean by a range of foreign trawlers, right? They are in cahoots with corrupt government officials.
In 2009, Kumi Naidoo made history when he was appointed the first African to head Greenpeace. At the helm of the organization, Kumi has charmed and forced his way into corporate boardrooms, gaining support for his broad climate change and social justice agenda.
Let's make this march a historical march.
Though his leadership of Greenpeace has been welcomed, his approach to revitalizing the organization has earned him plenty of detractors. One of his harshest critics is the organization's co-founder. Paul Watson accused Kumi of betraying the group's roots in the environmental movement and turning it into a fundraising machine. Working with Greenpeace, Naidoo has been involved in many acts of civil disobedience that include embarking on a hunger strike in 2009. The Netherlands-based Greenpeace Group has nearly 3 million paying members and 2,500 employees.
Welcome back. You're watching Africa 360, and my guest today is Kumi Naidoo. Let's talk about your work at Greenpeace. You're the first African to be the international executive director of this organization. A lot of people previously thought it was a very Eurocentric type of organization. What are your thoughts on this?
The challenge of reorganizing and reorientating the organization has been a challenge.
Okay.
Right? But
have you made any headway?
Positively, we have made lots of progress. Today, one, we are prioritizing based on an analysis of which parts of the world are going to be most critically central to winning on climate change and so on. So we're putting significantly more resources than we were doing previously in China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Africa, particularly in West Africa, the Congo Basin, and Southern Africa, and other parts of the developing world. So the one actually in terms of really putting our money where our mouth is, we are investing more in terms of building capacity there and raising the amount of campaigns. And I'm very happy to say that it's bearing results with some very significant battles. The second thing is we want to campaign more together with people, okay, right? And we want the narrative of environmentalism to be more people-centric. So, because see, in the old days, people had a thing where this is the environment and this is poverty. Those are two things in contradiction. And one of the things that I think we've all learned is that the struggle against poverty and the struggle to address the environmental issues and climate change particularly must be and can be and should be seen as two sides of the same coin.
Okay, so you've just outlined what you've achieved in 6 years, and you have been commended by some for that, but obviously, there's been some criticism, even from ex-officials who worked for Greenpeace, such as Paul Watson, and I will give you a quote of what he says. He says, "You are betraying the group roots in environmental movement and turning it into a fundraising machine and social welfare group." He goes on to say, "You make statements about protecting the planet by alleviating world poverty. That doesn't make sense." Basically, here he's labeling you as a sellout.
I respect Sea Shepherd very, very deeply as an organization, which Paul Watson works for. I just disagree with him. And I welcome the criticism because, you see, he is saying addressing poverty and addressing environment are two contradictory things. And I think that's just a Western northern perspective, which I cannot accept, though I respect his right to say it. And I think that criticism helps keep me and Greenpeace honest, and I have no problems with criticism of that nature.
Let's go to the grassroots level now and just tell me, what is the public's perception of climate change, especially here in Africa? When you look at my grandmother in the village, does she really understand what climate change is all about?
Well, interestingly, I think almost people who live in certain contexts in Africa where there's water scarcity, land issues, where it's become too hot to plant certain kinds of crops and so on. I think they are actually ahead of some of our governments who just sit, government leaders who just sit primarily in urban centers and are cocooned from it.
They're ahead in what way?
They're ahead in the sense of at least they're saying, like we did, Greenpeace Africa did a documentary in 2010 for when the climate negotiations was here, looking at 3 regions and going like Lake Turkana, Ghana, I think, and Drakensberg. We went to in KwaZulu-Natal, just doing studies with local people, and they will tell you that the rain is not coming when it used to come before. the sun is not shining when it
But do they have a
was.
voice?
No, they don't have a voice.
They need to get that voice.
Yeah. So the struggle right now is really about ensuring that the people most impacted by climate change must have more of a voice, because I believe that when they tell the stories about how their lives are transforming and how, in fact, climate change is driving conflict, driving problems.
But what are you
around
doing
agriculture.
to give them that voice?
So let me just give you an example. If we look at West Africa, there's been a raping of our ocean by a range of foreign trawlers, right? They are in cahoots with corrupt government officials where they were getting licenses and so on. So in the past, Greenpeace would mainly go put their ships in front of our little inflatables in front of those that are illegally fishing and so on. However, that was only part of how we won in Senegal, for example.
Okay.
Because what we did there, we worked together with the local fishing communities. We dialogued with them, we found out what the issues, and for example, when we were meeting with ministers of fisheries in Europe, where we were trying to get them to change their policies, when I went into those meetings, say with the Spanish fisheries minister, I didn't go alone or with just Greenpeace staff. I went with a Mauritanian fisher representative, and two from Senegal. And when we went, and the eloquence with which those people are able to speak about it is much more than somebody who has not lived it, right? So that's how, so we're using the fact that Greenpeace has a certain power and certain political access, not saying that, okay, we'll just ask the people what they want and then we'll go talk for them. We are trying to, for example, get people directly to have voice. And on that one, we got the common, Europe to change the common fisheries policy. And you know, the Senegalese government then cancelled, as a result of Greenpeace working together with the fisher folk, cancelled all the foreign license, put a moratorium. And within like 6 months, we saw fish that people thought had gone extinct coming back. People were catching enough fish to feed their families and so on.
4 years ago, Kumi Naidoo made world headlines when he and his colleagues were arrested in Greenland, where they led a protest against an oil drilling project in the Arctic. One they deemed reckless and dangerous to the environment. Kumi climbed the oil rig to deliver a petition with thousands of signatures from all over the world. He and another activist were later arrested for trespassing. At the time, he remained defiant, saying the scaling of the Arctic was one of the most defining environmental battles of our age.
Today, the minimum ice level in the Arctic will be measured. It will show that it is the lowest ever recorded in human history. This spells catastrophe for the climate and the people who live on it.
Let's take you back to 2011 when you were arrested in the Arctic for scaling the oil rig off the coast of Greenland. You said you described it as a defining moment. Just tell us more about this.
Well, firstly, an African in the Arctic is a bit of a contradiction because it's extremely cold even in the summer months. So many of my friends and colleagues in Africa said, hey, what has the Arctic got to do with us? And I said, well, listen, unlike, you know, our American friends say what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, sadly what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic, because the melting of the Arctic sea ice, especially certain glaciers in Greenland, as a result, that's happening because we're burning so much oil, coal and gas, right? Okay. Carbon. And that is what's contributing to sea level rise, which, by the way, is already impacting on certain parts of Africa, certain, for example, Ghanaian coastal villages. We know what we're seeing in Bangladesh, for example, with sea level rise pushing people out. So that struggle is a very important one. And so far, you know, lots of people are joining it, but we have real challenges with companies like Shell and the Russian company Gazprom, which we also protested against last year and the year before, and will continue. But the good thing is the Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, met with me and my team in September. He acknowledged, he actually thanked us for the passion that we brought to the struggle on the Arctic, and he shares with us 100% our concern. And we've called on him to do a special summit on the Arctic so that we can, basically what we need to do is get a treaty like we have in Antarctica. In Antarctica, Greenpeace and other organizations won a treaty decades ago which said no industrial activity, no fishing, no mining, and so on, only educational and scientific use, and that's what we are trying to get for the upper part of the Arctic.
Mr. Naidoo, we'll have to end the interview here, but thank you very much for taking your time and speaking to Africa 360.
Thank you very much for having me.
And that brings us to the end of this week's episode of Africa 360. Tweet us your views at A360_eNCA, or you can join the debate by going to our Facebook page. You can also send us an email to africa360@enca.com. So until next time, it's goodbye for now.